Very excited to have Dr. Ruan in the house. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm good. Well, for the audience to know, I met Dr. Ron at a immersion trip to Costa Rica, where we will both be hosting retreats. Mine next year, his this year, and we got to talking about alcohol, and I love to hear from the medical perspective, and I really love to hear people who are passionate about educating people about the effects about alcohol and other things that can really help us prevent disease and risk in our lives. So I'm really excited for this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. It's one thing is from the medical perspective, and there's another thing really from the performance perspective that we have to talk about. And
I'm excited.
yeah,
I'm excited. Let me write that down so I don't forget to ask you on that. Okay, so I'm so curious. Tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, how you would explain to someone how alcohol affects the body, the brain, our neurotransmitters. If you could just give us a little lesson in that, that'd be great.
sure. So, the thing about alcohol, now it's not surprising that there's been plenty of studies showing that alcohol has a lot of detriment directly and indirectly to brain cells. And not surprisingly, there's effects on the liver, right? Effects on the blood vessels and whatnot. So that's all nice to know. But if we want to look at alcohol as an impact on the entire life, on the way that we live, it can have a pretty significant impact, and doesn't have to be a whole lot to create that significant impact. So, if we think about it, alcohol, a lot of things that we do, this human nature, part of their social construct and social norm does involve alcohol, right? Whether it's wine or beer or hard liquor, and different parts of the world has different cultural attachments, to the use of alcohol, and there's nothing wrong with that. So we have to honor that there is a cultural tie to it. There's nothing wrong with it, but we have to take that with a grain of salt, because even though there's a cultural tie, things that we traditionally do, if it no longer serves us the way that we currently are, then we have to kind of be able to pick that up. you know and there's different generational effects in alcohol as well. So let's talk about the direct effects and indirect effects. So if we look at the direct effects of alcohol, if people use it as a bonding mechanism, they're tying really the habit of drinking to a bonding mechanism that may allow them to be within a tribe, if you will, right? And so, from a neurotransmitter effect, the actual thought of drinking alcohol becomes very pleasurable, and they can create a lot of beautiful thoughts and feelings about it, right? But what happens is, when alcohol is consumed, and even 24 to 48 hours later on, there are things that physiologically happens to the body. The body goes into this mode where it recognizes that there may be alcohol in the system, and the brain will create compensation mechanisms. Okay. And so alcohol activates this neurotransmitter called GABA, and GABA is the thing that kind of calms us down. It's similar to how like Xanax kind of works, the pharmaceutical prescriptions. And so when that calms us down, what we think is happening, what our brain tells us happening, is that we're just chilling. We're having a good time, where we maybe are more like disinhibited. We can be ourselves and be open more. What really is happening is that the brain is kind of fooled into thinking that whatever we're doing right now is part of a normal ecosystem, and it's not. And so afterwards, the brain will compensate by creating more the opposite of GABA, which is excitatory neurotransmitters like dopamine and glutamate, etc. And so that can create post-alcohol effects, like really bad sleep, like terrible sleep that night. Some people will say, "Oh, you know what? I tend to like snore when I'm alcohol, but when I don't, like I don't." That's because you literally have this sense of suffocation, causing obstruction in the physical airway, and that's one of the effects of alcohol as well, right? And that deteriorates poor quality sleep. And then you have this sort of effect where your body will go through a series where it's trying to, okay, now we have this toxin, this alcohol that's in the system. we're going to propagate the liver to kind of do its thing to try to detox out. Now, if you, the person, have already other things that you're trying to detox out, for example, there's inflammatory foods, maybe pollution that's in the environment. If you live in a place with high pollution, like I do here in Houston, then your liver's already like doing its thing, right? And the liver's job is actually also to metabolize protein into neurotransmitters as well. And so that balance becomes very off-kiltered with the direct and indirect effect of alcohol over time. So the idea is to, well, how do you like, unhook the association between the use of alcohol and what we're supposed to do is within a tribe environment, right? And how do we create that bonding experience? And I think that's where you come in because there's a lot of ways to do it, away from alcohol.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how like we can really see that it's, like you said, a cultural association. It's not rooted in fact, or it's not rooted in necessarily reality. It's kind of what we've put onto this drink, right? And I think also our culture in a way is changing. I mean, not everywhere at one time, but like now there's these pockets of really celebration of this alcohol-free movement, new bars, new clubs, new groups, where really it's not the new glue that, puts you together. It's like we're celebrating people's choice to not drink necessarily. So I want to dig deeper a little bit into the science. So alcohol is metabolized in our body and turns into, I'm going to embarrass myself by trying to say this word, but acetaldehyde.
Acetaldehyde.
Acetaldehyde. Thank you so much. Can you explain a little bit about that process and then what that chemical does to our body?
Yeah, so acetaldehyde is basically, it's a toxin. As it accumulates in your body will create lots of inflammation just because it's present there, right? Acetaldehyde is a type of similar to formaldehyde, which is what they preserve like the bodies with, when we're playing around in the science experiments in medical school. Acetaldehyde itself is supposed to be broken down, right, using another liver enzyme called acetaldehyde dehydrogenase. And some people have less of it than others, which is why when I drink alcohol, I get bright red because my redness is actually coming from a massive dump of histamine. Your body's like, whoa, this is not supposed to be here. So I'm going to dump a ton of histamine to alert you, the person, that there's something wrong. Let's stop drinking, right? And so that redness, that flushing, that's really common in East Asian people. Now it's not called the Asian flush or something like that, but it's common in different environments. That redness, that flushing, even in people with intact acetaldehyde dehydrogenase enzymes, can create chronic inflammatory issues and histamine issues, right? And so this is why people have higher chances of having asthma attacks, after drinking alcohol. People have higher chances of having a histamine effect on the brain, okay? So what is a histamine effect on the brain? Attention deficit, all right? And so a lot of people's attention deficit can get worsened with alcohol. People can have memory issues, even long-term memory issues. I'm talking about while you're sober as well. So a lot of it is propagated by this conversion of ethanol into acetaldehyde that's in the body, and that's, like I said, got not so great consequences, especially when it comes to like brain performance.
Yeah. So when we're in this like overly inflammatory state, we've got more histamines going through our body. How does that affect some of our other neurotransmitters like serotonin or the brain in other ways?
Really good question. So when you have a high histamine effect, histamine is just like cortisol, which is a hormone for that fight or flight response, right? And so chronic alcohol use elevates histamine over time. And when you have cortisol that's produced over time, it blocks the production of progesterone. So progesterone is awesome because it feels good in men and women. So progesterone stimulates production and the conversion of serotonin, which is the happiness neurotransmitter. And then we make melatonin from serotonin. So we sleep because we're happier, right? So this is why when people are in sort of high anxious state, they get insomnia because we don't necessarily have this serotonin to begin with. And that anxiety state doesn't activate the progesterone pathway. which means that hormonally the person is not ready to get into sleep, and therefore a lot of insomnia can really be affected. So this is why if you have, let's say, the effects of alcohol plus someone with a history of anxiety or PTSD or something like that, it makes it just 10 times worse, right? Now, your brain gets tricked into thinking that it temporarily feels good because you're being quote unquote sedated. But the minute that wears off, the histamine goes up, the cortisol goes up, the insomnia goes up, the sleep quality goes down, right? And that creates accelerated aging process. And so one of the things that I always talk about melatonin's job is not just to get into deep sleep. Melatonin literally regenerates your body. That's like the fountain of youth, this fountain of melatonin, I call it, right? So it actually changes your gene expressions for sort of a rejuvenation effect, right? It controls tens of thousands of different gene expressions called epigenetic expressions. And also it upregulates stem cells. So stem cells are the cells in our body that regenerate our cells, And so that mechanism is only possible when you don't have too much histamine laying around.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, this is so good. I'm so glad to have you here to be asking these questions. So when you started the show, you mentioned how alcohol affects brain cells. Is there anything else about brain health that you haven't already mentioned as a phenomenon because of alcohol?
Yeah. So far we've been just talking about direct effects. Let's talk about indirect effects because they're actually more important than direct effects. So we mentioned earlier that when you drink alcohol, your body can go into this inflammatory state for a period of time afterwards, elevating this histamine effect, right? Okay. Now, this affects our personalities a lot, which means that if our mind is constantly in sort of this fight or flight, it affects our financial decisions, it affects our business making decisions, it affects our relationship with loved ones, right? So these, although they're indirect effects, they're still effects that are there. And so there's this term that people use, like, oh, I don't like this person when he or she's drinking, or I like this person much better when they're sober, right? So because the personality actually becomes quite different. And that's something, that indirect effect is more important because it has sort of a momentous process, right? Each little decision in our lives will aggregate, accumulate into a mountain of other different decisions that affect not just us, but our ecosystem and the people that are around us, right? And so now, do you have to be drinking alcohol every day for that effect to happen? Well, the answer is no, not necessarily. It really depends on what you're utilizing it for, right? And so that level of contribution to our daily decision making can compound into massive actions or inactions over time. I'm not saying inaction is bad or action is good. What I'm saying is that sometimes when we take a lot of action and we're like, swimming down the river, but we may be going against the actual current of life and we're trying to do, and we just end up going nowhere, right? And that's something to really think about. Another level of indirect action of alcohol is what I kind of mentioned earlier, is hormonally. So earlier I talked about there's whenever our body goes into this fight or flight stage chronically over time, and alcohol trains our body to do that more and more over time, our histamine gets elevated and progesterone comes down. Well, progesterone is made from pregnenolone, and these two actually direct the entire hormone pathway of our bodies. So men, we make testosterone from pregnenolone and progesterone, right? And then women make progesterone, estrogen, and all that from progesterone as well. And so what's happening here is that, if you notice that there's been a lot of talk about a lot of men having low testosterone over time. Well, yeah, alcohol is a big direct effect. Or women having earlier menopause and menopausal symptoms, alcohol is a massive effect as well, right? And so all these things that we just think are hormonal issues, we really have to take into consideration the things that we're actually putting into our body has a huge consequence in hormonal disruptions as well. And so that would be more of an indirect effect over time of alcohol, just from a biological process. So we talked about behaviors, we talked about biological process. Now let's talk about a third aspect, which is breathing. Okay, you're like, well, this is interesting. So what happens is that the way that we live our lives is very much breath dependent, right? So I know there's sort of this focus on like breathing nowadays, especially like pranayama breathing and alternate nostril breathing and different breathing techniques that can really enhance the ability for our brain to go into this sort of meditative state, right? So as it turns out, alcohol, and we know this because I do a lot of brain mapping in my practice, where we literally map out people's brains to see what it's like. So as it turns out, there are things that alcohol does over chronically to people's brains, where the brain will go into what's called a limbo state. Okay, and so a limbo state meaning that the frequency, the lower it gets to the frequency, the deeper sleep you're supposed to be in. So you don't get into too low of a frequency, and then the super high frequency you're in, the more of an excitation, agitated state you're in. So what happens is people try to go to sleep. They can't go into deep sleep when they're supposed to be like excited or agitated for that fight or flight response. They can't fully go into that, so they're blunted. They're really like in this limbo zone and this blunted, right? So what happens is that when you're in this limbo zone and you're blunted, your brain actually doesn't tell you to take a breath. You literally like start holding your breath over time. That builds up a lot of toxins, carbon dioxide in your system, right? And so over a number of years, what that actually does is that you literally your breath is less than what it's supposed to be. So it affects your metabolism, okay? It affects your neurotransmitters big time. And your body thinks that, hey, I have less air, therefore all I can do is age, at this point, right? And so the performance of the body comes down, quite a bit. And then the second element to breath is that if you drink alcohol and your histamin's chronically elevated, well, you make mucus, right? And so what happens is that you get kind of gunked up and more mucousy in your sinuses, and people get used to it over time. They start mouth breathing. The problem with mouth breathing, it's really hard to activate the anti-aging systems in your body, like nitric oxide system, that really just activates the nasal breathing. But if you have a thick layer of mucus over there over time, your mucus, which is stored in what's called your mucosa, can thicken this entire area, decreasing the airway, decreasing the air velocity really into breathing, right? And so so that effect in its own has a huge ramification on the way our body is, because in Chinese medicine, breath is life, it's qi, right? It's energy, right? And if you talk to someone from Hawaii or the Polynesian Islands, they call it mana, right? And so if you talk to someone in Ayurvedic medicine, it's prana, right? There's different terms for these energetic flows. It really starts with breath, right? So even from a holistic perspective and philosophy, breath and energy is limited when you're drinking alcohol, especially chronically.
Wow, this is so fascinating. Like, I'm learning so much new stuff here. I remember in Costa Rica, you told me something along the lines of like the medical profession or the healthcare system has known that alcohol has adverse effects, but what's been changing in recent years or decades is how much, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the American Heart Association came out with what sort of a reasonable amount of drinking wine is, because it's got antioxidants, right? Not knocking against wine, but that's the American Heart Association. They're focused on one area, which is this right here, right? But if you talk to anybody that's not just the heart, but looking at brain function, especially Dr. Daniel Amen, who's probably the most famous for Amen clinics and the number of books he's written, and he talked about it on a I believe it was TikTok or Instagram Live. I can't remember what it was, with Miley Cyrus, who was one of his clients, right? And he talked about that, is that there's no amount of alcohol that's actually great for the brain. And so there shouldn't really necessarily be sort of an allowed amount from a medical side, according to him. And I kind of do agree with that, right? But but here's the thing is even if we label it, something bad, the minute that we have an allowable amount, it just gives the public a reason to do it, right? And so that's what we used to see in the 60s with cigarettes. Like there was an allowed amount for cigarettes. Nowadays, that's like incomprehensible, you know. And so I think that there's a cultural phenomenon here of kind of making the decisions within ourselves and knowing, what's really best for us. But from a medical standpoint, I don't think any medical body should be putting out sort of an allowed amount for alcohol. It just doesn't necessarily make any sense. And I know where the data is from, and the data is from it's from multiple Mediterranean studies. But the reason why there's a allowed amount there is that they looked at these Mediterranean population and see what they're actually doing, and there's a lot of longevity there. Well, they didn't take into account the fact that they live in like very big families, and there's so much relationship that's developed in these areas, right? And they didn't really look at the fact that people were really supporting each other into a very cohesive tribe, and that's what makes the blue zones of the earth the blue zones, which means they have the highest amount of people age over 100, the centenarians. And so I think it's taking into one thing into context, kind of cherry picking it and say, hey, maybe alcohol is a allowed amount there. But yeah, to me, there's just so much more to the science behind it.
Yeah, I love that take on it because like you said, like people can do whatever they want, but I think it's so confusing when you're actually looking at something. I remember literally reevaluating the role of alcohol in my life and being like, but I'm supposed to have a glass of red wine a day. Like my intuition was saying, please stop doing this to our body, please take a break. But like, it was the misinformation really that can keep people stuck assuming that it's actually some kind of health beverage that you're supposed to take. And I love, even referencing those Mediterranean studies, like the cherry picking, if you're looking like at a goat shepherd with a, huge supportive family and just a completely different pace of life compared to like what we do in our modern kind of cities, like it's really hard to just extrapolate that one thing and say this is the key to longevity. Okay, I love it. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I would love to talk a little bit about how you practice mind-body medicine. I think a lot of us might have had experiences with Western medicine and feeling unheard or stuck about, certain conditions. I would love to know your philosophy on just health and preventing disease.
Yeah, so we've technically been talking about mind-body medicine this whole time. So a lot of what mind-body medicine is using your intuition and within yourself to generate a specific outcome, and that specific outcome is living your best life, right? So in mind-body medicine, the focus is not necessarily on the disease states, right? But really focusing on an ease state. Like how do you get to the ease and not dis-ease, right? How do you get to living in an optimal life? So for me, I sort of have the East meets West philosophy. My mother is an acupuncturist and Eastern medicine doctor, herbalist. And so the idea behind mind-body medicine is that whatever we think about in our minds has a direct effect on the body and vice versa. There's no line between mental health and physical health. Like there's none, right? And there shouldn't be because it's been proven that and here's the best example of a mind-body connection. So here's two examples. The first example is that there's some people that and if they get upset and they're angry and they get super red and sometimes they get a little itchy. Okay, so medicine we call it stress urticaria. Like you get stressed and then your histamine just comes out. Well, that just means that your belief system just created a histamine trigger, and histamine causes all sorts of bad stuff in health, right? Blood pressure, chronic blood pressure elevation, asthma, sinus issues, stuff like that, right? And so why should there be much of a difference? And the other example, really easy, is that if you or someone goes to see a scary movie, a scary scene comes on, and you get super frightened, like sometimes people will look white and pale. It's because all the blood flow goes away from the face. So essentially what happened is that you just received external information from the outside world that literally took away blood flow from an area of your body that's supposed to have blood flow. And over time, that caused disease, right? And so that doesn't feel very good. And maybe after that scary scene, maybe you're eating popcorn in the movie theater and it was so scary and upsetting, maybe you threw up. And I've seen that happen before in middle school. But what's happening is that the blood flow goes away from the gut at that time because the body's in fight or flight mode. And when you're in fight or flight mode, it's like eating popcorn in a movie. It's kind of like, drinking a milkshake while running away from a tiger in olden times. It just doesn't compute, right? And so the body's not set up for that process. So this concept of mind body medicine is, well, we know those things are not so great, but are there things that we can do to optimize our body's form and function? Is it breath work? Is it mindfulness? Is it meditation? Is it qigong? Is it tai chi? Is it some other cultural aspects of what we can do? And that's sort of the practice of mind body medicine. Now, I am not trained in mind body medicine, but I know a lot of it because at Texas Center for Lifestyle Medicine, where I'm the CEO, we have mind body medicine programs. And my job is to obsess over the data output, meaning that patients will go into these programs. We're seeing that they have significant improvement in all sorts of different disease states. It doesn't matter if it's diabetes or high blood pressure or memory loss or PTSD or ADHD. Like, mind body medicine is sort of the foundation of how people can improve. And for those people who don't choose to go that route, some people don't improve or some people improve, but it takes 10 times longer, right? And so creating sort of that mind body medicine strategy is just absolutely crucial to overall health.
Yeah. So it sounds like, if I could interpret what I'm hearing too, is that, like, if you were, struggling with some kind of health condition as well, it's really looking at it from a lot of more different angles and a lot more kind of levers or, things that you can empower yourself to do or change in your life. Obviously not completely dismissing Western medicine or the, amazing things that we can do, the treatments there, but like also not dismissing all the other stuff that you could do to maybe heal those emotions or other tensions that your body is causing.
Yeah, actually, the act of dismissing and rejection is actually it's actually not part of mind body medicine. My part of mind body medicine is allocating resources to the best that you can, right, and not necessarily dismissing or rejecting anything. And it's we're lucky enough in modern times that there's a lot of tools that people can use for health, but the hyper focus has been what's called outcome-based medicine. So outcome-based medicine is basically like high blood pressure. Well, is that a disease? Well, not really, just a number being high of a thing like a blood pressure cuff that humans have made over time. Well, what's normal? What's normal was defined back in 1965, right? And we have sort of the normal quote unquote range. Well, who made up normal range? As it turns out, it wasn't doctors. It was statisticians who actually looked at thousands of people over time and made the standard deviation curve, right? Which hasn't been updated since 1965, And so, so this idea of normalcy actually is actually relatively man-made. So this is what's called outcome-based medicine, or cholesterol, right? Cholesterol numbers. That's just something that we see in a lab. In fact, the cholesterol numbers aren't even cholesterol. There's no machine to measure cholesterol in the body. So what you're measuring is called lipoproteins that may represent cholesterol in the body, for example, right? And so, so these, and even diabetes. Diabetes means that your blood sugar is high, but people don't magically one day have high blood sugar. There's always a range over time. And so, what the concept of mind body medicine is that everything is sort of on the spectrum. And whether someone has high blood pressure, or diabetes, or dementia, or fibromyalgia, or what PTSD, whatever they have, right, or when they have all of the above that I just said, which a lot of people do. The idea is, all these things individually is super overwhelming, even for doctors. They're super overwhelming, right? But what are some basic systems we can optimize for all of the above, right? And that's not what's really focused on. And that's really the study of mind body medicine. And the best part about it is mind body medicine is tools that we can already use within us. We could be anywhere. You don't have to spend money on breathing, I promise. You don't have to spend money on movements, right? Flow, meditative processes, right? And so it's generally very accessible, but not only is it accessible, it's far superior to starting on what's called outcome-based medicine, which we really have to get away with.
Yeah. Oh, well, it's such a refreshing take. I love that so much. I know you also help medical professionals who are feeling burnt out in the current system really discover their deeper why and continue to practice in a way that's fulfilling to them. So this might be a hard question, but if you had like one thing you could change about the modern healthcare industry, like in Western countries like the United States, what would you want to change?
Ooh, just one thing, huh?
I mean, you could share a few if it's easier.
I'll pick one thing. I think that let's talk about medical professionals for a second. It's really important. Suicide within the medical profession is at an all-time high. It is an ungodly high number, right? And in fact, about one doctor commits suicide a day, and that's just doctors. I'm not even including nurses or dentists and the things, right? And it's really scary statistics. And 55% of the healthcare force will leave the healthcare industry by 2025. That's a much bigger issue, right? And a big portion of this really is started even before the global pandemic. I think the global pandemic just kind of accelerated it, right? And so the question is why? Well, the question is, the answer is uncertainty. There's uncertainty within the medical profession. There's uncertainty within government regulated bodies, right? There's uncertainty within the patients themselves. So that's one. And number two is abundance. There is an abundance of information on the internet. And now with the creation of like ChatGPT-4 and all the stuff like that, in about a year, search engines will no longer exist. It's all going to be AI-based algorithmic answers, right? Even right now, like what's today, March 20th, 2023, even like today, if you put your blood work results like into an AI engine, it'll spit out more details than your doctors can ever tell you, right? But are they right? Well, we don't know. That's the problem, right? And so now there's a huge abundance of information. I think burnout's going to get worse with the advent of artificial intelligence. But the one thing that I would change for medical professionals is that medical professionals have a really hard time adapting to technology, right? The way that medicine's practiced right now hasn't changed in 200 years. It doesn't make sense that we're doing what we did 200 years ago in terms of like medical outcomes and stuff like that. But if we go back 300 years ago, that's where it's at. So 300 years ago, if you look at tribes, well, who are the leaders of the tribes? You have political leaders, and then you have the healers, right? Shamanic healers and stuff, right? So even just 300 years ago, healthcare professionals were the leaders in the tribe, right? That's not the case right now in 2023. The one thing I would change about the healthcare profession is that, we, especially as doctors, like we have to own up to the word doctor, because the doctor comes from the Latin word scholar, or to teach, right? And so if every doctor has an identity of being a teacher or a scholar for public, then we wouldn't have as huge of a public health issue at this point. And so I think one thing I would change about the health profession is to identify the health professionals as teachers. Each one of us we're actually teachers, not limited to just the one-on-one doctor-patient exam rooms and stuff like that, because the patients aren't getting the education from the doctors. They're getting from the internet, they're getting from AI, right? And so we have to be the one to adopt this new technology to do so, which is why I kind of created the Physician Transformation Institute, is to attach sort of the ancient healing strategies of shamanic healers and that concept, right? Plus AI and all the sort of new disrupting tech that's out there, and marry in one beautiful ecosystem for us to create sort of a newer age or modernized version of where medicine is supposed to be.
Wow. It sounds like you're giving also so much more autonomy to the leader to also make changes within the system instead of be a victim to the system.
Well, yeah. So in the United States, most doctors don't even know this, is that the system right now is actually already set up for physicians to be leaders, even within private practice and medical practices. And you can actually educate your patients in groups and get reimbursed by government as well as medical insurance for it. Like most doctors don't even know that, right? Mm-hmm. And so the system already exists. And in fact, there's already reimbursement for artificial intelligence and imaging analysis. All right, that happened January 1st, 2023. There's reimbursement strategies for phone, text, emailing, secure messaging with the patients. There's even reimbursements for like your doctor talking to another one of your doctors, like without you there and collaborating. Like doctors don't even know that, right? So we build the business based on, what these systems have been developed for us. That just makes it, 10 times better, right? And so I think that adaptation to technology and also knowing like what's already available out there is just super important.
Well, Dr. Ruan, I could continue talking to you for a long time. You're so educational, very empowering. Both obviously so much doors open, minds blown about your take on alcohol, but also just this incredible forward-thinking way of looking at medicine, the medical field, and bringing back that mind-body wisdom that I think has been so valuable. Thank you so much for being on the show. Can you tell the listeners real quick where they can find you and learn more about you?
Yeah, so I put out quite a bit of content, especially on Instagram and Facebook. So it's my name, Cheng Ruan, MD, Cheng. Last name is Ruan, MD. Find me on LinkedIn, especially if you're a healthcare professional. I have a newsletter called Rebuilding Healthcare, and it's my take on on all the things I think should change with healthcare and where we should go with it. And then the other thing is my medical practice, which I oversee, and there's many of us within the practice, is Texas Center for Lifestyle Medicine.
Awesome. Wonderful. We'll be sure to include all of those links in the show notes below. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.